Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. Today, I'm once again joined by my good and faithful co-host, Mr. Dale Stenberg, here broadcasting from the city of Garland, Texas. Dale has been visiting me for a couple of days. If you're listening to the podcast instead of seeing it on YouTube, you'll miss the special charm of us just sitting next to each other, having this. Dale having his whiskey. I have my good trusty beer from my friend Wade here. And one of the things we've been doing as we've been talking over the last week and working on all sorts of important projects, because of course that's what we do.
That's right.
One of the things we've been talking about is sort of a typical Christian approach to media. This has been a big topic that we've talked about privately on and off for a couple of years. And recently, I read an article that was a sort of review of the recent Netflix show, The Queen's Gambit.
Right.
And if you've seen The Queen's Gambit, of course, that's been all the rage
Yes.
in the past couple of months. But I read this review, and it seemed to me to have this kind of very shallow. It was one of these reviews, of course. It was from a kind of conservative media outlet, and it was one of these reviews that you can tell as sort of being the fuddy-duddy review. You know, it was the review that says like, well, everybody's enjoying the show right now, so why don't I complain about it?
Right.
You know, like there's a whole genre of that.
Yes.
So this fellow writes this review, and basically his critique boiled down to something along the lines of, first of all, there's not a whole lot of morality to be drawn from chess. And that raised my ire, and
Right.
I could talk about that, but I won't.
Sure.
But the other thing he raised was sort of like there wasn't really heroism in the tale, because this particular character never really helps anybody but themselves.
Right.
And that struck me as so morally and interpretively innocuous. That we thought today we'll talk about this because it's actually an important subject. It's important to understand, I think, in a deep way, how stories and how media communicates morality and moves us, how it does that in ways that we don't think it's doing it, and how it's not doing it in ways that we do think it's doing it. And so a really important conversation is just what is actually happening to us when we sit in front of a story,
Mhm.
you know, when we go watch that film or we read that novel or we confront a piece of art, what is inevitably happening to the human being in the presence of that artifact, if you will? And maybe Dale, I could, throw to you. So that's sort of a question. You know, what is our typical approach? What is sort of the evangelical? And again, this is not to crap on evangelicals or something. We're both conservative evangelicals.
Sure.
We want to be. We're proud of it. We like our tradition.
Yep.
Nevertheless, in our communities, maybe there's a tendency. There are certain tendencies on the ground in the way that we approach cultural artifacts. And I guess fair to ask you, like, what do you see when you're talking to your average fellow Christian? What do you see as kind of the kind of default settings of their approach to cultural artifacts?
Yeah, it's a good question. Joe and I actually argued about this for a couple hours this morning. It was a good conversation, and that's why I think we wanted to just talk about it and see where it goes. So this is very unscripted and sort of off the cuff. So if we say anything, just give us grace because we're still working through all this as well. I think there's an impulse for Christians to try to find the morality of the actions of characters and stories. That way we can walk away and say, okay, this story is about X, Y, and Z. This is how we, should understand things like courage or strength or honesty or integrity or merit or whatever. And if the character displays these things, then, we sort of slap the label of hero on them.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with Queen's Gambit, and for those who haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's a series on Netflix. I think you mentioned that.
Yeah.
And it's about this young orphan, female orphan, and she gets adopted. But before she gets adopted, she learns how to play chess from, I think he's a janitor.
Yeah.
And she falls in love with chess, and she ends up being real good at it. And spoiler alerts, she goes on to make a name for herself in the chess world.
Yeah.
Specifically as a woman, because women are not in that world at this point in history.
Yeah.
but she develops a drinking problem, and she has to, because she rises to a level of popularity and fame, and she's in the magazines, and she's getting the invites to all the real big chess tournaments. And as a result, she feels pressure. She has this horrible childhood. She starts drinking a lot.
Yeah.
And she actually has to overcome that if she's going to continue her career in chess.
Right.
And she does that successfully.
Yeah.
So one of the critiques of the critique that Joe's talking about is that, no, there was actually a moral component to this story. She was heroic in the fact that she overcame a vice in order to pursue her craft. Yeah. And this is to say nothing about the morality of chess. And Joe and I have been playing a ton of chess since I've been here. We both love the game deeply. But that tells you that when you get an editor that comes along and thinks it's a good idea to criticize this Netflix series because it doesn't contain any moral lessons, just how shallow their understanding of what stories are supposed to be doing.
Right.
And that's really where our conversation was going.
Yeah.
So I guess where we could start is, and Joe's much better. Joe has a degree in film, so he,
Oh no, it's in humanities.
That's right. But you took classes in film.
I took classes in film.
Right.
Yeah. That could distort your understanding of film. Just to be.
That's right.
There's some crazy things in there.
Yes. But I guess what we could start with is just by saying, what is it that we're actually doing when we encounter a story through any medium?
Yeah.
What is it that's going on with us in a phenomenological sense when we read the Odyssey, or when we see Queen's Gambit, or when we watch Captain Marvel?
This is where the morality of this kind of media question, I think, the more profound questions were asked by people like Augustine, and these are big questions all the way through the 19th century, is, should we subject ourselves to the sort of musings of the theater? Because a good director, now there's badly told stories, there's lame films out there, but a good director is a person who can make you feel, for the most part, whatever you want. He or she wants you to feel.
Yeah.
They can put you in a position to be sympathetic with whatever character they want you to be sympathetic with. They do that through music and all sorts of sort of amalgam of an amalgam of skills, if you will. And so in the kind of older model, I think there's even though most of the church and most Christians actually disagree with the sort of don't read novels, don't go to the theater sort of approach, that moral impulse was coming from a pretty insightful evaluation of how these media work.
Yeah.
That is what they recognized, is when you read that novel, when you go see that play, and in our case, when you watch that film, you just are going to have things happen to you because a spell is being woven over you. And what the church and most people have done at this point is say, in principle, that's an okay thing. In principle, it's okay to confront the kinds of artifacts that are just going to have a certain kind of effect on you. And the fact that it's going to have that certain kind of effect on you is not to say that you don't bring your critical faculties. It's not to say that there's no evaluative mechanisms that sort of come out of that experience and then say, what do I really think about that? Clearly the film wants me to feel this way, but what do I actually think about that subject? Do I think it was fair, et cetera? There's all those sorts of questions. The thing is I think nowadays what we see on the ground is a kind of shallow reading of how these mechanisms work.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, if I write that book called The Scarlet Letter with an adulteress in it, then we're normalizing adultery. That's the big concern. It's interesting. We think that's a lefty concern, sort of like, oh, look what you're normalizing.
Yeah.
It's also a very right-wing concern. Oh, look what you're normalizing. Now the gay character is showing up in every television program. Now this is getting representation and that is getting representation, and there's an agenda behind it. And there's a lot of truth in that. There are people making decisions at high levels that are trying to put in representation that are trying to normalize certain things, and that is all true. But what is also true is that the final effect, the manner in which that actually works, is mediated by what the thing itself is.
Yeah.
That is to say, you have to take the art piece kind of on its own terms, and whether it actually functions to normalize something, or actually functions if you're not sort of disposed to normalize X, it might be that you confront that artifact and you say, I see that the author wants to normalize X, but I also see that it's not successful in doing that, because the way that it is talking about X, this particular sinner's life or something like that, in the case of a biopic, for instance, the way that this is doing that is just showing a life, and all I see is a life. And actually when I look at this life and I see these details and I get inside this person's head, all I really come away with is, I don't think this should be normalized at all. Actually, this seems kind of sad.
Sure.
And it's actually that actually shows in an interesting way, whatever the kind of intention of the maker is, that you've made a good piece of art. Because what a bad piece of art is trying to do is to sort of didactically just shove something at you.
Yeah.
And I think the evangelical approach to art and to these kinds of artifacts is very much like this. It tends to be, we valorize and celebrate those persons who sort of like wax sentimental about sort of ethical standards we like, or something like this. And then get concerned when you see all those characters who don't act according to the ethical standards we like, because that's normalizing it and this is shoving righteousness. And I'm really unpersuaded that that's how these things actually work. And I'll give you an example. Like, again, I don't think anybody ever read The Scarlet Letter, and said, what, I'm going to go commit adultery now, or something like that. But what's interesting is that, on the one hand, I think we take a kind of set of demands on the pieces of art. Like, here are the things I don't want you to violate, and don't do this, and you better say that, and blah, blah, blah. And that's the headspace we come in. And so we fail to maybe take something on its own terms. So what's the story it's telling? What headspace is it trying to get me in? What does the world look like in there? And what's ironic is that we actually, because the reason we're doing that is we're afraid of being shaped in a certain way. We don't want it to charm us in some certain way. And so we kind of have our dukes up and we're ready to kind of resist its punches and block all the signals it's trying to send to us. And what's interesting is that's not the way usually it works in the first place. There's not no grain of truth in that. There is some agenda and yada, it works that way in the masses or whatever. But a lot of the ways that these images and film work is actually shaping you in a much more subtle and deep way. And so the example I always go back to is most of us have seen, either in a novel or in a film, just a bazillion love stories.
Yeah.
Right. And they share varying shades of morality by Christian standards. But we've all seen a bazillion love stories. And there's a rough formula, there's sort of flirtation, and they're on again, off again, because that's a little bit, it's a little bit sexy in the story. And then finally they're together, they break up if it's a tragedy or whatever. Nevertheless, what's interesting is almost always especially in any big film industry thing, it's a very attractive guy and a very attractive girl. That's what's going to be on the screen. And that's the language of film. Like, since film has started, we have been staring at attractive people. Yeah. And it's deeply, deeply affected human consciousness that we stare at attractive people this often. Yeah. It's a well-studied phenomenon. It's deeply effective. It deeply affects human consciousness. And so that's the language. If we have a love story, it's between attractive people, and then you produce, a generation of people who it's like, oh, well, if she's not a 9, then I just can't even, this kind of thing. But then on the other side of that, it's like all of a sudden we make Christian movies over here, and then we're making a Christian love story, where they're not doing all the bad stuff, but the story is they're getting together and it's all, there's
still attractive man.
Exactly. Yeah. It's still, of course, it's a love story. So it's an attractive man and it's an attractive woman. And what's interesting is that message has been subtly internalized by us for generations. And even like sort of Christian film industry stuff is playing right into it. And you say the same thing in the Christian music industry, right? It's sort of like, on the one hand, it sounds like it's sort of counter message. We can make the argument that it's counter message informing us differently. And yet it's mostly dominated by the same kind of therapeutic language and sort of approach to life and reality and godliness that dominates all of our other ethics. It more deeply internalizes something in the name of resisting it. And some of this is just a basic failure, I think, to understand how these artifacts are working. And I think if you approach them on their own terms, it absolutely does not mean that you cease to be critical of them. And it doesn't mean there's some like universal standard where I can say, go listen to this music or watch those movies. Every Christian should be able to do that. That's a different question.
Yeah.
Whether that's wise or good or moral, that's a totally different question.
Right.
What we're talking about is just the phenomenality of the thing itself. If you watch a certain film or read a certain book and you kind of just let it do its thing, you're going to be moved in a certain way.
Yeah.
And if you and the real question comes in then, how does the godly wise person sort of sit themselves? It's the moving the passions, right? Passivity. It's the you're being moved by a magician, as it were, who's charming you into a certain headspace. And then the evaluative faculties come in like, okay, I was sort of transfigured into this headspace. Now I'm out of it. Is that good? Is that a good way to think? Is that what the world's really like? And what happens sometimes is some stories unexpectedly, even though they have an agenda in principle, what's interesting is to get inside of the story is to walk away saying, I don't think any of the things they're trying to do with this story really flow out of the story itself.
Yeah.
The story itself actually is just a story about a human being making decisions with the same strengths and weaknesses of every human being. And actually, the moral lessons I infer from this are very different from what they want me to, precisely because it's a good story.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and like zooming out a little bit, stories, I think what our temptation is, and let me not say perhaps what my temptation is to bring a set of standards, like I was talking about, to a story, a set of moral standards to a story through which I can discern who the hero of the story is.
Right.
Joseph Campbell's written a lot about the hero, hero with 1,000 faces. He was the architect behind the hero's journey.
Right.
Sort of how you can identify the hero. He must go through this. In every story arc, you find the same pattern that the hero follows. And you can look at it and go, aha, there's the hero of the story. And that's good. We should recognize patterns. This is just wisdom. This is natural law.
Yeah,
this is just the way that humans exist in reality. But as modern age becomes much more complex and the cultural issues become much more difficult to parse, then if you're not engaging with stories on a deep, visceral level of sort of internalizing the plot and thinking through all the tricky, hairy twists and turns of what is going on here, then you can just come to simple conclusions like, well, this person didn't do this thing, so therefore we shouldn't, as Christians, that doesn't tell us anything.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that we move from reading books and watching movies and listening to music with that real simplistic, rigid system of what a hero typically looks like. And then we sort of imprint that onto everybody's story in our real life.
Right.
Like if you don't look like this thing from a distance, if I move into Joe Minich's story, right, which I did.
Yeah,
I've come over here in Texas. I moved right all up into your story.
Right here. Yeah,
right.
This is it.
But if I move into that and I'm holding you by just encountering each other, and we have these standards of things. And by the way, what I'm not saying is Christians don't have standards.
Yeah, of course.
What I am saying is if I'm imprinting on you a particular understanding of what a hero should look like,
right,
and you fail to meet all those things, then I can sort of say, oh, this is because you're not a hero and you're weak. You need to be a better hero.
Yeah.
And that misses the entire idea of stories.
Yeah. Well, so a good example of that is like, it's sort of like, Yeah, I can see this working in both directions, where it's sort of like there's stories about the guy who does the heroic thing, and film is a great medium for this. It can tell the story about the guy who's like honestly an adulterer, Schindler's List or something like
Right.
that, right? The dude's an adulterer, and yet he does do something quite heroic, and it's impossible not to honor him over it, like to feel like there is
Sure.
something heroic in this kind of tale. And that's not saying go watch Schindler's List if you don't want to see that. And the other side, the other side of that I find interesting is that very often the people who best communicate the virtues in film and in literature aren't people that are trying to.
Yeah.
They're just trying to capture life in an immediate way. And as they try to capture life and its kind of joy and its flavor, we all sort of can latch onto it and say, oh, good, look, they made the thing that we're sentimental about. So, I think of like the first 10, 15 minutes of the movie Up, which are just this perfect sort of Pixar.
If you don't cry with Up, there's something wrong with you.
It's this beautiful, beautiful 10, 15 minutes of a life.
Sure.
But you don't, the thing is it's funny because like, I think on sort of our side of things, a bunch of people sort of latched onto that. Oh, look, this is so much obviously better than, other lives that are out there, that sort of thing.
Yes.
But the reason that person seems to me likely able to make that is not because they were sitting around thinking, I need to throw family values at the culture, which is not, I'm not saying that's a bad thing to do.
Yeah.
I'm just saying the piece of art didn't come from the headspace of, I have this agenda that I need to accomplish, so let me make a piece of art that accomplishes that agenda. Rather, it was, you all want to love and have a family and settle down, and like we have hopes, and those hopes are dashed, and there's grievance in real life. It was just being real about a real life that everybody could look at and say, yeah, it's basically a meaningful existence.
Yeah.
Like that was the entire language it trafficked in. And that's actually the most beautiful trafficking. And that's the most beautiful language of film, is precisely that it can traffic in that kind of language, and that it can, for instance, another thing film can do, and I have to think of examples. There's one example I'm thinking of with Michelle Williams, where she has a dog, and I'm forgetting the name of the film.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yes, I do.
You
might not know.
Michelle Williams and a dog. You'll find it.
That's right.
But it depicts actually several acts of a kind of heroism, but they're so mild. Like the virtue that
and this is where I want to dig into. But go ahead.
Yeah,
right, exactly.
it takes the virtue that it takes. So part of what's going on with the heroes is that you're sort of seeing these characters do these great deeds, right? And that's wonderful. Like we should have that, you know. So like the old war movies or whatever, that's good.
Braveheart,
absolutely. I mean, like I'm not going to criticize Braveheart. Sure. Like you can turn the program off if you don't like Braveheart. But we're always, there's these grandiose acts. And one of the things that film and literature, especially in kind of modern realist literature, is so good at doing is portraying heroic levels of virtue that show up in really ordinary lives in really small ways. And I think that's a beautiful thing that I think the Christian imagination especially ought to be very attuned to. And we also ought to be tuned to the fact, there's in conservative circles, again, and I value this virtue very much. There's a lot of talk of like courage, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of talk about like, this is the moment where not time to sit down, time to fight, that kind of thing. That's true. There's some real truth in that. Nevertheless, it's important to ask things like what, we're talking about media, the way media has shaped us. Your perception of what courage is didn't come to you in a vacuum.
Yes.
Your perception of what the competent man is that I should aspire to be is not some abstraction that you're moving toward. It's always encoded in a collection, whether explicit or tacit, of exemplars. And I think that we need to look at like and I'm not trying to do the sort of Jesus and John Wayne thing, right? Nevertheless, like we need to recognize like, all these people running around talking about courage, what is the image of courage to them? If I were to look at the collection of 100 people they considered courageous and aggregate from it, what I might infer is not necessarily a great commentary on courage.
Yeah.
What I might infer is a great commentary on what their visceral association with courage was, which is then being enacted kind of dogmatically on the ground. Whereas you can go this other direction and say, this is the importance of stories. What the importance of stories does is it says, hey, look at this person that you would ordinarily think of as weak.
Yeah.
You would actually ordinarily pass by this person and you'd be like, that guy
Yes.
doesn't have that guy's whatever. That guy's not going to accomplish anything. And then you see, wait, no, you see that person in the context of a whole narrative. And again, this is Lewis, right?
Yeah.
The measure of the hero is not so much, this isn't quite the way he said it, but you could infer this from it. The measure of a hero is not so much like, what are all the externals?
Yes.
It's rather how far in the journey did this person go? If they started over here and they're here,
right,
that might take a level of will and moral vantage point and genuine adventure of soul to achieve a result that for you looks very small.
Right. And I think the New Testament is pregnant with this message. We see there is a calling to men in particular, I think, in the modern age, to sort of because masculinity is something that we just have to say has been under assault through various mediums and various political movements. It just has.
Yeah, it's toxic. We talk about toxic masculinity, but we don't talk about positive and virtuous masculinity,
and maybe one of the
non-trivial ways, at least.
Yes, and maybe one of the temptations is to feel the assaults on masculinity as men.
Yeah.
Trying to lead families and just exist, and we go, okay, they're assaulting my masculinity. It's time for me to be super masculine. And what that looks like is X, because I watched a movie where the most masculine figure was the dude covered in blood with the ripped wife beater and an AR-15 mowing people down that were coming to the village.
And that's a profoundly unmasculine way to...
Right, exactly. Because masculinity, and this is Thomas Aquinas, right? Aquinas talked about effeminate men as those that were carried away from the good by their passion. Those that ceased pursuing the good course because they were, like you were saying, affected by their passions. I get so wrapped up in trying to prove this thing that I actually end up doing bad things just because I moved that way emotionally, rather than keeping my head on and trying to pursue the good.
Yeah.
And this is what you just said there about the ordinary everyday man. And we had Mark Oliveira and Matt Miller on. Was that the last one? That was the last one we did.
It was 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Talking about the power of biography. And we were talking about these are just ordinary people for the most part. And we'd like to see more biographies written about just ordinary people. Because in an ordinary person's life, their heroism might be expressed in the fact that they just have to actually get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
They have to consciously tell themselves, all I'm desiring, all of my passions, everything inside of me says, stay in bed. Your life is miserable. Nobody likes you. I hate the world. There's nothing out there
that's
for me.
That's a real lived, that's an actual internal world of somebody. Yes.
And because of 2020 and COVID, we're seeing this mental
all
health
over
thing
the place.
all over the place.
Yes, that's right.
And so heroism in that context might look like this dude just getting out of bed, putting on his tennis shoes, and going for a walk around the block. Right. Because it's taking every ounce of his courage to face the thing that he just does not want to face at all.
Right.
And when we measure that, what and this goes back to what we were talking about with standards. When we measure that, what we're doing is we're casting a vision of what heroism looks like as the dude that just has everything, has all of the courage that goes after the dragon and plunges the spear into the heart. And that is courage. But the dragon could be getting out of bed.
Yes.
The dragon could be a number of things in the modern world that ordinary people struggle with.
Right.
And so that could be interpreted by some as weak. Like, oh, you're just weak.
Yeah.
What's the matter with you?
And there's some truth to that. Like, it's like,
sure.
And this is where the New Testament talks about weakness and God's power being
manifested in weakness.
Through our weakness.
Yes.
Of course we're weak. Everybody's weak in a certain sort of way. And some people's weakness is much more obvious than others and has real life implications. Like, one thing you and I aren't saying is like the dude who can barely get out of bed and can just make it down the street. We're saying, like, through a Christian lens, and really, I think that's also just a rational lens.
Yeah.
I think you could look at that dude and look at his or her whole story and say, in the context of this story, that's actually quite a heroic act.
Yes.
Now, there's other stories where if that's all you can do, hey, buddy, that's not quite heroic. Maybe we should
go
all the way around.
You actually need to man up.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's never decontextualized entirely from the story.
Yes.
And that's the key. And
yes.
And the other key there is we're not necessarily the best at reading that. Where we draw the line is deeply shaped by a bundle of impressions and pressures and sort of the tendencies to need to prove ourselves.
Yeah.
But
which is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, it's okay if you need to prove yourself to the world, because that just means that you're trying to live up to the vision that you have of yourself in your community. And that's just becoming what God is calling you to be. So it could be perverted. In other words,
yeah.
Joe's blinking. I know when Joe blinks, I'm like,
oh no! Right. Do we disagree?
Right. And that's okay if we do.
Yeah, of course.
What I'm saying is, it's okay if you have if you feel like you're not living up to the thing that God has called you to be, and you move out with an intent desire to accomplish the goals that you think God is calling you to. He's equipped you with all these gifts. He's given you all these things, and you're just like not giving it what you should be giving it.
Yeah.
And you sit down at night and you're like, are you really giving everything? Like, could you do more, Dale?
Yeah, right.
Duh, I can do more.
Right.
And so I need to actually go out there, and people notice your talents, and people invest in you, and they're giving you confidence and
right.
they're expecting things out
right.
of you. And I need to go out there and I need to prove this, but I need to prove it in a healthy way, which is just to say, like, we give the energy towards fulfilling our potential that we can give it. And when we don't give it, we don't beat ourselves up, but we consciously recognize I can give more. And when people call you to your potential, you shouldn't feel harmed. But if they're calling you to something that they've a standard that they've designed in their head because they don't actually understand your particular story, they're not involved in your particular context,
right.
They don't have a way to frame you graciously, and they're just like, you need to do blah because I think you should do blah because my vision of what men are is blah. When if they do that, then that's not wise.
Yeah.
And what I think what you and I would agree on, and what we're trying to say is, you can't actually call people to something unless you understand their entire, not their entire story, but but if you can't understand their story in some capacity, to understand where they're still struggling, then. And that's not where you struggle.
Right.
So you actually...
It's really to say, I think, like, what it looks like for somebody to be moving toward the good is highly inflected through whatever their story is. And so, like, it's people like Jordan Peterson who say things like this, right? Like, don't compare yourself to that guy over there. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday. And it's really to be moving on in repentance and godliness is largely a matter of, our friend Jim again, largely a matter of movement, largely a matter of movement toward Christ. And you see, and so again, for that guy, it might be the person guy or girl, that might be a person who sits up out of bed and walks around the block. That might be a movement toward a healthy, ordered life for that person. And that might be a movement toward godliness for that person. And they should feel all the pleasure of the Holy Spirit at that movement.
Yes.
And that's not saying, again, that person is going to be an elder tomorrow, right? We're not saying like you can only make it to the end of the block and you have Jesus's grace in your life.
Right.
So there's political realities of being an elder. Being an elder requires a certain it requires a certain kind of external competence that is important for the task of governing a church and this sort of thing. But what it does mean is that nevertheless, the kind of story of the hero that we can look up to and learn from is a story that belongs in some sense to all Christians. All Christians have gifts to offer the church, and this is your spiritual gift again. And I'm getting this from my good friend Jim, who Dale and I just met. We're talking to our friend Jim Pop,
and I love Jim.
Jim and I and Jim and Dale and I had a really good time.
Yes.
But one of his themes is sort of like your spiritual gift comes out of your story. It's not like you just get this light beam of you're a giver, you're a this, you're a that. Rather, these are types of people. They're types of people who might be using these things for very sinister ends, but rather God is, inflected through your actual life narrative, growing something in you that you have to give to the church. And the Christian has always had their eyeball on this. I mean, this is why, even in old traditions where you're doing the lives of the saints, very often they're just ordinary people.
Yeah.
That's the story. Another thing I think I want to double down on. Oh no, let me get back to this notion of proving ourselves. So just to clarify,
sure.
I do think like there's a sociological sense in which you do have to prove yourself in a particular way if you're just trying to gain respect in a certain kind of community. So you go to a job, you better show up on time, you better be a blessing to your boss, you show that you're the helpful one, you've proven yourself, therefore you get the promotion. That's a reality. But there's a type of, when I use the language of something rooted in proving ourselves, more what I mean is like we get a kind of insecure, like I don't want to be that thing, right? And so like the classic, well, there's plenty of classic examples, but it's like I don't want to be a not masculine guy. So here's all the things that look masculine. So let me just hyper move toward all of those in this kind of shallow, external, performative way, so that I'm mostly persuading myself.
Yes.
And scratching an insecurity that I'm not one of those guys who isn't doing the real thing with the real men. That happens all the time with these fragile egoed males like us.
Yes, right, exactly.
Because that's just, males are fragile egoed in a lot of ways. And so there's an identity construction going on there that's always part of it. And you even see that on the other side, it's like, the other side of that is the guy who's like, well, I'm really a male because I'm defending women or something like that. So I'm really
the white knight is, right.
And so there's this other, we're just sort of scripting ourselves as like the real virtue of masculinity.
And even with, even in the, gay community, Douglas Murray, I think is a prime example of this when he says like in the gay community, you actually, in order to be accepted, you have to like say all the right gay things, and you have to, and this is a gay man writing this book, The Chaos of Crowds.
Oh, The Madness of Crowds?
The Madness of Crowds, sorry, The Madness of Crowds. And he's saying like, and if you don't toe the gay line, then you're not really a gay guy, right? Even if the guy's gay. And so in that sense, you could be called to prove yourself in that context, as a truly gay dude. And so the young gay guy that's coming up, he might think, okay, I got to go do all these things that are really gay, in order to be accepted.
Yes, there's a hyper performativity that becomes nature,
right? And
so performance can become nature in a certain way through habituation.
Yes,
and the other thing I guess what I was saying earlier, or trying to start up earlier, was I think that I'd want to double down on is, so I've made this claim that sometimes, sort of authors of various cultural artifacts, film or a novel, something like this, sometimes they are trying to like shove you into a certain headspace. They're trying to motivate you in some way. Like that's part of what they're after, is to motivate you to make a certain kind of moral judgment. I'm not arguing that the intentions of the authors or the community that produced this thing don't matter. They matter very much. What I'm nevertheless arguing is that a good art, interestingly, to become good art that translates so well in the human community, and that's what good art tends to do, is like, sometimes we see abstract art and we're like, that's ridiculous, but sometimes we see one and we're like, I don't know why, but this translates well just to everybody encounters it, and it just spreads like wildfire.
Yes.
And a good artist knows how to kind of strike that language where it translates across communities of people and touches them in this visceral way. And in order to do that, even if you have an agenda, like I want to get them in this headspace so that they'll make this particular moral or cultural or political judgment. In order to do that, though, you can't be that heavy-handed. You can't be saying, this is the gay film that's trying to get you to think this thing about the gays or something like that.
Right.
That is the movie that everybody's going to watch and be like, oh, like move, and like it's an agenda. What you have to do is just make a story about people.
Yes.
And when you just make a story about people, the thing is like your authorial intent has to kind of smash into this form. It has to be communicated in this kind of more universal language.
Yes.
But once you enter that universal language, what people can fairly authentically draw from where this is going, because where this is going is quite different. Because in other words, maybe another way of saying this is this: to make a really good story and a really good piece of art, you have to smash your thing into the shape of something like reality, because that's what actually makes it universal. But once you do that, because reality is what it is and is not what it's not, the actual kind of arrows that are pointing by means of that story are very often away from what you yourself want those arrows to be.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fascinating, and that works in both directions. So it's like there's that film that you might, or book that you might be like, I don't know, that's a dangerous thing to read. And then you read it and you're like, no, this was actually very insightful. This helped me understand something. On the other hand, there's that moral tale that on the surface, looks really good and kind and whatever. And yet what it's suggesting about reality in a deeper way, in a structural way, you take these Christian movies, again, example, the Fight the Giants or whatever is, there's a couple of brothers. I think they make a couple of these movies.
Right.
And all of the movies they're bad stories. They really are. They're not real. Like no lives actually look anything like this. And the solutions to real problems are never this smooth.
Yeah.
That's not what it's ever like. And so it really is just scratching good, I watched a moral tale itch that, I was able to consume a thing that was sentimental about things I care deeply about. And it has consumptive value in that sense. But it's not shaping the imagination in any real way.
Yeah.
And often, I guess what I'm trying to argue there is the capacity of good pieces of art, good cultural artifacts to shape the imagination is greater than merely the personal thoughts of the author. And the example I think about with this, and maybe I might have mentioned this on Pilgrim Faith before, maybe more than once. But N.K. Jemisin is the author of this Broken Earth trilogy. It won 3 consecutive Hugo Awards. She's an African-American sci-fi author, female, which is pretty remarkable. Females have written sci-fi for a long time, but sort of 3 consecutive Hugo Awards, very remarkable. So I read these books, and they're really interesting. They describe kind of a phenomenology of oppression at a literary level, like sort of what would it be like to have the experience of somebody where the world looked this way? What kinds of judgments would I form? And it puts you in the head of somebody living with a range of these kinds of it's very good world building, really complex and deep historical systems of oppression. And it really is very helpful for just shoving you into the headspace, getting charmed into the headspace, where you say, you know what, it's not that like there's any excuse for A, B, and C if you feel this thing, but if I honestly, with an ordinary range of human virtues, had this collection of experiences, my tendency would be to do this and to think this way, and vice versa. But what's interesting is when this same author goes on Twitter and starts talking about politics at a theoretical level, I think she's profoundly non-insightful. It's all cookie cutter critical theory, just sort of jargon.
Yeah.
Which I don't think parses up reality, and not never, but for the most part, I don't think it parses up reality in that illuminating of a way, especially if it's coming from a place of resentment.
Sure,
and
it's
anger.
just kind of like boring.
Yes,
And,
again, especially when it seems a little fueled by anger. But putting that in a literary key,
yes,
putting that in the key of like, here's just what it feels like to be alive to me, putting it that way is actually very helpful and insightful, because now you know what you're working with, because again, it's just talking about what it's like to be a human being with this collection of contingencies.
Right.
And that's what literature does, is it opens the imagination, helps you sort of fuse those horizons. And that doesn't mean your theories or your critical judgment goes away. But it's nevertheless, sometimes it's films with characters that are the least sympathetic to us, or stories with characters that are least sympathetic to us, maybe not heroes, maybe they're villains at the end of the day, but that are the most useful for us because they're villains in ways that we might be villains.
Sure.
You know what? If I were, Thomas Hardy is wonderful. You read Jude the Obscure, Tess of D'Urbervilles, or however you say that.
Yeah.
And all Thomas Hardy is trying to do is say, here's a life. And if you were in these circumstances, buddy, don't be too impressed with yourself, because the idea that you would be better than this guy, and he's not that sympathetic at the end of the day. There's things he does that aren't very sympathetic, but the idea that you're obviously going to do something different, you rather walk away from a story like that saying, oh boy, there but for the grace of God would go I.
Yeah. And I think this is why Jesus is the greatest example of the ideal of the hero.
Right.
I mean, in his context, Jesus is like sympathetic to women.
Yep.
Even, and it's, I know that there's arguments about the woman at the well. Was she really an adulteress? I think the general consensus up to this point is like, yes, she was.
Yeah.
So just let's take the worst possible reading of the woman at the well and say, yes, she's a horrible adulteress. The way that Jesus dealt with her, he would have been criticized by the religious figures for like putting up with the trash. Like if you were a man, if you were the real hero, then you would have drug her before the Sanhedrin so we could stone her. And even in the context of the woman that was about to get stoned, and Jesus sort of, writes something in the sand and draws everyone's attention to their own sin. Like Jesus is flipping norms during that time period in the world all on their head.
Yeah.
And I could imagine a certain cross-section of that culture looking at him and going, wait a minute, this is not the King of Israel. The King of Israel, the story of the King of Israel as we know it, looks like this.
Yep.
You couldn't possibly be that because you don't match up to all the things that we think you should be.
Jesus isn't masculine enough.
Yeah, right. And he doesn't check all the boxes off to match the hero or the king. And so this is why I think Jesus really gives us the grid, and that's for what we should be looking at when we talk about stories as we're sort of winding down here in general. And we should be looking at individual stories, and we should be deeply interested in getting to know what's happening in the story of Dale Stenberg.
Yes.
What's happening in the story of Joseph Minich, and what are the things that they could be considered heroic when they overcome.
Yeah. You and I have been talking a lot about Daryl Davis.
Yeah.
This African-American gentleman who, and I think I mentioned him on the program several times because I he's a hero of mine. He really is. This guy helped 200 people come out of the KKK. And there's a documentary about him called Accidental Courtesy. And it's very fascinating because, what was so fascinating in the documentary portrayal is he never, and this is important, he never doesn't say the truth.
Yeah.
He never doesn't say like, hey, I find this kind of racist ideology detestable or, gross. Like, he's very upfront about that very early in his relationships with these men. But what he also does is say, you're just a dude. like the way he approaches people is, you're just a guy. And at the end of the day, human beings are human beings. The reason you're caught up in things is the reason most people, given your story, would get caught up in things. And so let me just sit here and I'm going to figure your story out. I'm going to listen to you talk about what you're worried about. I'm going to listen to you talk about how you got involved in the first place. And he's getting in touch with these people's story, and he has his own story, and his people, his heritage has a story, and he brings those together. And as it turns out, he just wins them through the overwhelming power of this story sharing thing that is friendship. And that's an interesting way of thinking about friendship, is that it's a fusion of our stories together.
Yeah.
And what he tries to do is enter their story with his own, and he's going to fuse into theirs whether they like it or not.
Yeah.
As long as they just don't kick him away.
Yeah.
So as long as they don't absolutely say go away,
yes,
he's that persistent guy who's
Yes.
going to stick around. And what's interesting though is that, you know, you're at some point you wind up motivating people by their virtues. You know, you wind up confronting somebody in a story, and you see, you know, you're not just this. You're also a dignified son of Adam.
Yeah.
You're also the structure that you are. What you also are is this thing. And what I want to do is summon that. I want to charm that out of you. I want to be the voice that's affirming that thing in you, so that your soul, literally, as C.S. Lewis talks about, you know, Peter with a, you know, Peter gets his little sword and he looked kingly.
Yeah.
What I want to do is throw kindling on the fire of whatever is kingly in you,
Yeah.
and watch that just flower. And when you feel the dignity of that, you're going to feel, by contrast, the grossness of the path you've taken in this other area.
And I guess the point that we're trying to make is, you can't do that if the first instinct is to like take all the things that make you your hero in your story and then impute it on this person and expect them to react the same way that you
Right.
do, because
Yeah.
that's just not the
That's
way it
yeah,
is.
that's not the way reality works.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that this is just what we're basically talking about, is just wisdom. This is just basically being a wise person, that you move towards others in a recognition that they're all coming from their own context with their own stories, and they're all struggling with certain things. And it doesn't diminish the fact that we can call sin,
Absolutely.
or promote virtue where it's clear,
Yep.
or to be very direct and plain in the way that we are discipling people in our life, or the way that we receive discipleship.
Right.
But that it takes more color than just simply saying, here's what it looks like.
Well, when do you know, the big question to me, like the money question, is when do you write somebody off?
Yeah.
And what's interesting in this documentary with Daryl Davis is, at the end, he's talking to, you know, there's moments where he's talking, you know, here's an African-American gentleman talking to people from the Southern Poverty Law Center, or he's talking to some early activists in Baltimore that were part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And the people in the Black Lives Matter movement just couldn't stand his project, because I'm not saying this about all BLM persons. It's just the particular persons that were interviewed in this program. But what's interesting about them as individuals is their thought was like, white supremacists can't be changed. Like, that's just those people are beyond redemption. And what he's trying to persuade them of is, no, they're not, because they're just people.
Yep.
Just like you. And then you can, you know, in both directions need to hear that. The thing that you're afraid of, that guy that is like the, you know, kind of the epitome of evil to you, most of the time, they're just people. They can be demonic.
Yeah.
Like, they can go out into the world and be demonic. But when you befriend people and you actually move into their story in a more full-orbed, entire-personed way, again, it's not that he ever didn't say, like, hey, I think your ideology is detestable.
Yeah.
That was very straight up. But he also, I think, realized you're not just your ideology. That's not what any person is just an ideology.
Yes.
And so and I think that's, you know, I say this all the time because I think in our time, especially, I think in America right now, this is our deepest moral crisis in some way, in my judgment. And that is I think that we are all deeply ideologues. And I'm speaking of myself. Like, I really think that we look at people, and what we really see at the end of the day are collections of ideas come collections of actions. And that's just what they are. And especially when we try to have communities separated from it and they want their community over there, that's all they seem like, even, because that's literally all the contact we have with them. It's fascinating to me that very often the people who are, sort of prognosticating the worst results and the worst, whatever that's going to happen out there in the world, are the people that are actually least invested, skin in the game, if you will. They're the least invested in communities where they're around people like that they know in thicker ways.
Yeah.
And where they actually say, there's something valuable in this person,
Yes.
and I want to affirm their virtues.
Yeah, and I think just a last closing thing.
Absolutely.
But I think that a lot of pastors, a lot of elders will agree with you and I here, because what elders do, good elders that deeply care about their flock, that are, like you said, invested in their church, they're going to understand that everybody comes and they all have their own story.
Yeah.
And you have to deal with this couple that struggles with this thing, or this mother that's struggling with her son in this way, or this father that's dealing with these vices in this way. And that the movement towards the good, away from the bad, whatever that looks like, as long as there's movement, as long as there's a pursuit of the good and a turning away from the bad, then the pastor celebrates with those people. He celebrates with them like, oh, God's Spirit's working inside of you. And as we're working together and I'm watching you grow in the Lord, I'm rejoicing that Jesus has actually taken a hold of your life.
Yeah.
And I think we all need to think more pastorally, I guess, is what you and I are sort of saying in terms of story, is to say, where people begin, we need to evaluate their growth according to where they actually start.
Yeah.
And that it doesn't all look the same.
Right.
While we're all called to the same standard of morality that's given to us by God in nature and in the scriptures, what that movement towards that looks like. And it's not just morality for the sake of morality.
Right.
We're not just,
it's really ultimately movement toward God.
It's movement towards God.
Yeah, that's it.
By faith.
Yeah.
When you see people move towards God by faith, we should rejoice in that.
Yeah.
And we should be humble in recognizing that we don't possess all of the data necessary to make an accurate judgment about what that movement really looks like. And again, this is where we'll sort of like come full circle here. It's like, because in our weaknesses, God's power is made manifest.
Yeah. And this is, bringing it full circle as we're closing here. This was why the kind of Queen's Gambit thing was annoying to me. Is it sort of like, what I actually found it's precisely what this person found weak about it. I found it quite powerful, is sometimes the hero's story is the story about the person who, partially for the sake of their friends, there's people who love this person. So if you're there've been plenty of people who are surrounded by family and friends who love them very deeply, and they're just concerned about them. And all the community wants out of this person is just to get it together a little bit.
Yes.
If you can just not harm yourself. And this is more common than people think. That's another thing we need to say. It sounds like, we're just trying to talk about the 0.001%. We're really not.
Right.
We're talking about something that's much more common than people think. And there's a lot of people out there that honestly, what is for the community is precisely to try to basically order themselves, such that maybe their one gift manifests. And in this case, this person had an extraordinary gift. That was the other thing, is that actually there's a beauty in a game like chess, and actually being a beautiful chess craftsperson and playing a beautiful game is its own contribution to the human race that gives joy and adorns creation with the splendor of rationality. So it has its own virtues. Take us out, brother.
Yes. Where are we at with chess, by the way? I think Joe's probably up like 6-3, I think.
No, I think we're actually even. I think we're 3-3.
He's just being nice.
There.
And we're also being not pressured, but we do want to encourage everyone to head over to the YouTube channel. You can find that at davenantinstitute.org and go to Pilgrim Faith. That'll have a link. And subscribe and like and share the YouTube channel. We'd appreciate that very much. We're also on Facebook, so you can look us up on Facebook. We have a group and you guys can interact with us, so feel free to join the group and ask questions or ask clarifying questions about an episode or just start a conversation that you're interested in. But until then, Joe, love you, brother.
Love you too, man.
And we will see you guys next time.
See you later.